So I organized something that works in 3 parts. In the first part, which is very brief, I'm going to talk about experiential learning specifically in the law school context. In the second part, I'm going to talk about JCAP, the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project, and what it's been doing with students in terms of experiential learning. And then in the third part, I'm going to sort of bring together the discussion of experiential learning and JCAP and talk about sort of what it brings to students beyond just a skills training exercise. So experiential learning in legal education is probably fairly specific to the legal education as sort of a distinct mode of education. And so the traditional approach to practical or perhaps experiential learning in legal education has been the law clinic, which is typically almost like a firm, in that students will be supervised by a practicing lawyer. There are questions of liability, insurance. Students will be producing legal work under supervision, which as directly representing a client in some kind of a legal proceeding. So that's why the supervision of a practicing lawyer and the insurance and this sort of more formal law firm kind of setting is in place. And typically, or almost exclusively, students are working with legal aid clients, so they're meeting a need in a certain way. So it could be family law. But the point is that those enterprises are typically quite expensive to construct, especially in a context where there are increasing cutbacks to legal aid. So I think in this context, experiential learning is sort of gaining a lot of interesting ground. So it's different from the clinic in that typically a client is not being formally represented. It may be the case, but usually the student is engaging with practical legal conflicts in a slightly more removed way. So the idea in experiential learning is to immerse the student in either a simulated or a real legal situation, and give them an opportunity to sort of put legal skills into practice, which would be similar to the clinic as well. So they're analyzing real-life legal problems, and this, because it doesn't involve this formal client relationship, it's easier to incorporate something that's experiential learning style education into seminar courses or as volunteer opportunities, or through independent studies, directed research. So it's sort of flexible. Projects can be very discrete or larger. So it's quite a more flexible approach to that can fit into the law school curriculum in a variety of ways. So experiential learning is also, I think, in distinction from the clinic as well, a site of perhaps you could say an ideological struggle within legal education about what legal education is about. So because the law school is connected to the legal profession and is regulated by law societies, as is the profession, there's often sort of classical or paradigmatic tension between the perceived needs of the profession to produce law students who have skills, like hard, concrete skills, and also the perception that the academy or law professors sort of have a theoretical agendas that they're sort of rolling out in the classroom that are disconnected from practical skills or irrelevant. And that's particularly sort of connected to legal academics who are not doctrinal or don't simply focus on what the court says in cases, but are rather socio-legal individuals, meaning that they're sort of interested in studying law and society more broadly.
So does this mean that there's a bit of a conflict between the accrediting requirements, knowledge and skills compared to what the faculty actually want to teach classes?
Yeah, so experiential, I'm going to talk about how this plays out in terms of experiential learning, but in terms of the curriculum as well, and it is very connected, there's an increasing move for law societies to impose on law schools required courses, so that increasingly taking up the space with what is perceived to be practical or doctrinal classes, and leaving less and less space for classes that are more seminar-oriented or interdisciplinary, or would belong more in a socio-legal sort of a category. So in terms of experiential learning then, it is sort of touted or supported by both sides of that debate. So in terms of the side that would value the idea of hard skills, they see experiential learning as an opportunity for students to early on, before even graduating, start to engage those hard skills. They call this becoming practice ready, so that students would graduate from law school just ready to practice law, which involves a lot of technical sort of details. On the other side, those who are interested in socio-legal approaches to law argue that there is no such thing as practice ready without a capacity to think critically about the law, and that that's actually an essential component of being a lawyer and the lawyer's duty to society. So that's a bigger debate about legal, but those, the socio-legal studies side would see experiential learning as an opportunity to not only develop legal reasoning skills, analytical skills, and practical knowledge about the law, but also as an opportunity to interrogate some of the normative and relational issues that arise in legal conflicts, especially either between opposing parties or between the lawyer and the client. But it's an opportunity for students to think critically about the law as a phenomena in society, in particular legal rules, etc. And this approach to experiential learning would attempt, in order to ensure or facilitate or increase the possibility that experiential learning in law would be conducive to that sort of critical reflection. This type of experiential learning would attempt to give students sort of enough context and perspective on the particular legal issues that they might be working on. So it won't just be about legal analysis, but also looking at it in a historical, political, cultural, economic context.
If I could just interrupt, what is the earliest point in the curriculum right now where students get some experiential or real-life exposure to law?
Well, it will really vary. So experiential learning is very dependent on professors' sort of interests and networks, abilities. And it's really dependent on the law school. So some law schools have developed, for whatever reasons, historically, they start to have a critical mass of institutional support for and professors willing to do experiential learning style projects. So they might actually have it very much mainstreamed in the first year as an option. So that was the case at Osgood. There is an optional course that's not always experiential learning, but that can be. But it really depends on just the ambition of individual professors, typically. So whereas a clinic is more of an institution that's funded to a high amount within a law school, experiential learning kind of can come and go. It depends on a professor's willingness to really set it up for the student, follow through.
In every other faculty.
Exactly, yeah.
It's just about, hey?
It's about sort of
many other
initiatives that
faculties,
people
yeah.
take. And I think actually one thing that is interesting about experiential learning in terms of the way that it's seen institutionally is that it also really, at least in my experience, and especially in the socio-legal kind of version or approach to it, it does really depend on a professor's networks with communities and networks with those individuals who have the particular legal problems at issue. And often the professor's sort of background and networks in that regard are quite invisible or not necessarily always valued, I think, by the administration, because they are sort sort of taken for granted as something that just exists, but it actually is something that takes a lot of time to cultivate, and it's a special skill to be able to to connect into these issues, and then obviously to connect the student in a way that's successful. So it's it can often create a workload that's not always appreciated, I think, by so. Yeah, but I think most the ideal from a professor's perspective is to roll it into research and publishing.
Yes.
So that's necessary.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, your program is 3 years long, right?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So in the first year there is, and at TRU we actually have, and this is not, so JCAP is a separate sort of thing, but they do have a field trip that they do to the Kamloops residential school. Which is not experiential. I mean, it's a very, I would say, soft experiential in that they're not analyzing a legal problem. You know, there's no skills really there. It's more just exposure to the social side of the issues they're studying, in that case, in property law and Aboriginal law. So.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Does your program have a focus on Aboriginal law issues?
Not particularly,
Not particularly.
No, there are some people who are specialized in those courses that are offered, but there's no sort of emphasis beyond that. Yeah, I don't think
there
it's.
isn't a sort of like rural, small town kind of.
I don't think so as
I
well.
thought that was what they were saying
That
when
was
they
what
were
was
trying
kind of
to.
promoted as
Well,
well.
the
in order to
students-
get the law school.
Well, no, the students are often, like many of the students so the students do come from significantly from interior BC. So in that sense, I think, I mean, but that's not, you know, the student population is also very diverse.
Of course.
But in terms of the courses offered, I mean, it would be hard to think of how you would make them specific to rural. I mean, I think that the career services, giving people the tools with which they could start an independent practice in a small community is definitely in place, but that kind of thing is a little bit different from the actual study of,
Yes.
it's a little bit more about the business side, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you want to study, if you wanted to practice in a small community, what that often means is that you need to be able to do numerous things, so you won't be so specialized. You need to be able to do family,
Generous.
criminal. Yeah, exactly. So,
Sure.
and a person can do that sort of based on course selection. It's not that difficult. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more. What is the attrition from your program, say, after the first year?
I think it's very low. I'm not sure I don't have the statistics, but my impression is that it would be very low. Yeah.
Very low.
Yeah.
Huh?
I think there's just, you know, anomalies in terms of people leaving the program would be quite low.
Okay. So maybe your selection process that you use is well working if your attrition is low.
Yeah, I guess so. That's.
You select students, right? Because one of the links between the experiential kind of learning and the majority of other programs is that the earlier students get exposed to some real life engaging situations, it does affect retention.
Interesting.
If they can experience some of those in their first and second year, it helps motivate them and make a commitment as they enter their upper level courses. So
Right.
one of the things that we encourage in the Teaching Center for our other programs is to try to build some of these real life experiences for students at the beginning of the program rather than putting it off until later. 'Cause
Yeah,
that can really make a difference.
That's a great point. Yeah, I guess like the capacity of the law school to do that is a little bit constrained by the curriculum itself, and the fact that the law societies do impose on the first year curriculum particularly a very rigid sort of contract, property, criminal, like sort of fields of law, so-called fields. But actually we had, this is sort of not part of my presentation, but on a personal note, in the course that I just did, which is a course called Fundamental Legal Skills, where I teach them how to do legal analysis, how to do legal reasoning, how to construct a legal argument. I designed the course after my own area of interest, which is the conflicts between mining-affected communities in Latin America and Canadian mining companies. So I created a problem that involved a legal claim brought by a protester against the company for injuries that were
Was
suffered.
it based on a real case study or?
Yeah, definitely. So I based it on my own research and also on cases that are sort of at the very early stages right now in Canada. And so these are tort law cases. So that was great because the students found it very challenging, but also I think really interesting because it was connected to cases that are currently. But then we had this remarkable stroke of luck that following our moves last week, so following their final assignment, which was to present oral arguments before a mock court, we were able to bring in one of the Guatemalan plaintiffs from one of the actual cases in Canada. She happened to be in Vancouver, and so we found out about that, and the NGOs agreed to pay for her ticket to Kamloops. And so following their sort of final process of mooting or doing their oral arguments, they were able to hear her speak to her particular experience. And of course, she didn't speak at all. I mean, she has no formal education. She didn't speak at all to the legal issues around her claim, but rather to the really personal experience of confronting the problems associated with this particular Canadian mining company. So it was interesting. So before that presentation, I gave the students quite a few materials that would give them, because I thought, oh no, these students have only been looking at the law. They really need to quickly connect to something else. And so it was good. It worked really well. So that actually gave me the idea that it would be great if in that course we could always have, I don't know if I'll be teaching that course consistently, but I think it's great if that course does raise broader issues of justice in society, and if it would connect students, sort of the follow-up could be some kind of a consistent presence at the end of the course of one of the plaintiffs. So I know that for students it was extremely powerful, but it was just great timing that I had happened to design the course in that way, and that so they were really really thrilled. So that was a first year course as well. So
Excellent.
yeah, it was really lucky. So yeah, it definitely gave me an idea for how, but I don't know if I'll be doing that course going forward. So we'll see. Anyways, so now going on to the Justice Corporate Accountability Project, which is the specific sort of experiential learning enterprise that I've been involved in the past few years. So I actually began my work, I began the work that now spawned this when I was actually in my own, a clinical or an experiential learning program in my own law degree, where I began working on certain cases that then I just continued working on with a professor at Osgoode, and who I continue to work with, and who I did my LLM and my PhD under his supervision. So his name is Shini Mai. So he's a real guru in terms of clinical and experiential learning work, and we founded JCAP together, the Justice Corporate Accountability Project. So we founded it. We've been doing the work for probably since 2008, but we founded actually incorporated as an NGO and got a website and things like that in 2011. With 3 other lawyers who are on our board and who were consistently volunteering up until that point. They're very competent and committed. So basically JCAP, so this is part 2 of my presentation now about JCAP. So JCAP basically provides legal support to communities who are adversely affected by transnational resource extraction. So where transnational corporation is involved, and there are like some sort of legal conflicts. So we have sort of 3 principles that orient or guide our work. The first is the principle of community self-determination. So we are interested in supporting communities to pursue their view of the way their community should develop, the way their resources should be used. So their articulation in legal, sort of often packaged into the language of rights, claims to rights. We've worked with communities in Peru, Panama, Guatemala, Mexico, Kenya, and Canada. And we continue to work with communities in a lot of those countries. And so then the second principle is the principle of corporate accountability. So we work with a network, a global network essentially, of civil society actors who are all sort of concerned about the same issues. And what we bring to that network is something that's actually very lacking, which is legal expertise. So a lot of these actors are NGO workers or policy people, sort of people in the social sciences or even in the sciences, but often they lack sort of access to legal expertise. So we try to provide that through students. So we don't typically prefer to construct our projects in direct contact with communities in Latin America or abroad, because the logistics of that are very challenging, especially for a primarily volunteer organization. We have almost no budget. So we typically will rely on local NGOs or a network of local and international NGOs that are experts in terms of those regions or those communities that have the relationships, for already decades. And then we sort of feed they kind of feed us the issues, and we sort of feed back in legal research that will support them. So we're not actually suing companies, but rather we're giving legal analysis and legal information to communities that will assist them in terms of number of strategies. It's actually, and this kind of, we'll get into part 3 of my presentation, but there actually is no real often legal solutions to the problems that they have, and that's a product of the way the global economy and the law is structured. But anyways, in terms of the network, this consists of, we've worked with university professors in Canada and in Latin America, other legal clinics, international and grassroots human rights organizations, unions, and private law firms. We've worked with all of those actors. We continue to. It's really sort of whoever comes along and wants to work with us. So, and we do almost nothing to pursue the work. It just really comes to us. So there's just way more need than supply.
Now, are these communities often Aboriginal or not necessarily?
Primarily, so in Latin America, we often, I would say not 100% of the time, but mostly we've worked with Indigenous peoples. Almost 100% of the time it's Indigenous or Campesino, and Campesino is so categorizing these things is often a historical matter, and most of the Campesino or communities that we work with would be considered Indigenous under international law. Most of the time we're dealing with situations where there is some kind of a governance structure that's Indigenous, and some kind of a relationship with property and resources that's not Western. So but the actual legal status of different communities is often sort of context, depends on sort of local context. For example, in Guatemala, almost the entire country is considered Indigenous. In El Salvador, there is no such thing as an Indigenous person, and that's just what the law sort of says about how people are categorized. But we definitely work within sort of an Indigenous rights framework, and okay, so then the final principle that we sort of operate with is something that we call transnational legal activism. So here where students are doing legal work that's directly connected to the concerns of specific communities, as I said, and so they're really gaining the skills and experience to do something that we call community-based lawyering, but in a global economic context. So the concept of community-based lawyering is quite old, several decades old. The idea that, which is sort of an anthropologically evolved idea of how lawyers should relate to marginalized communities. So that's a whole sort of from the 60s and a stream of thinking. And so what we're doing is looking at how this plays out in the context of the global economy, or where the problems are now transnational. And so we call this community-based lawyering in the global economy. And these students are often then supervised in the work they're doing by pro bono lawyers, or directly by us as academics. So that's the legal activism part of it.
So you have a network of lawyers in addition to the two of you and the board.
Exactly, yeah. So the 3 others on the board are lawyers.
Yes.
2 of them practice Aboriginal law in Canada. One was doing mental health law, police accountability work until recently. Now she just moved on to a clinic, and then the 2 of us are academics. And so, the supervision happens. We also have lawyers who aren't on the board, but who are very connected, who do supervision. as well, yeah. A lot of this, Shin is sort of almost near retiring, and so he's really sort of taken this on in his personal project, because I was doing it, I was much more heavily involved in supervision until I had kids and went on the job market and became a full-time professor, but hopefully, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to pick up my supervision as well as I get to do seminar courses, hopefully, on this topic, so. Lobby the deans.
Yeah. Closer to home in BC, of course, there's all kinds of issues with Aboriginal groups and pipelines and fracking and water issues and all that. So do you get into that with students, kind of?
We have. So the thing is that First Nations in Canada have funds for lawyers, and they're often involved in very high stakes litigation. So the access to justice needs are different in Canada than they are abroad. So they often don't suffer from a lack of funding in terms of their legal counsel, but they may when funds run out. So it's not that the funds do always meet all the needs in Canada either. But there is definitely a sort of a very professional sector of lawyers who are dedicated to serving First Nations groups in Canada. And so we have given support to those communities, especially because it's very interesting that in the Canadian context, the focus of lawyers who practice Aboriginal law has typically been on constitutional challenges, political processes around land claims, some administrative law, or also criminal law, so defense of blockades. In our work with the transnational issues of the corporation operating abroad and the lack of a constitutional framework that would govern that, the lack of strong mechanisms in developing countries to hold these companies to account, we are engaging a lot more, and I'll get into this, that's actually my next thing, with corporate law and really creative ways of using international law, transnational law, corporate law to bring pressure onto companies in different ways. And so it's interesting that especially in Canada, as certain public law options weaken, like perhaps even through international trade agreements, those experts have actually begun to look to us for, how do we use corporate law? How do we use securities law? And some corporate law mechanisms. And so we have worked on corporate law related projects, or we've given some support there. So we do have a sort of a focus on the corporation specifically that does give us some knowledge that isn't sort of it's not the first thing that lawyers working with Aboriginal people in Canada typically think of, is how to sort of, what are the ways that corporate law can be, what avenues do corporate law give us? And it's, for us as well, it's very new. It's not typical that people who are critical of the corporation sort of start to use corporate law, and that's exactly what we're trying to do in a careful way. But so that sort of fits in. So we have done some project. We did do some legal work with regard to the it's escaping me now, the mine proposed near Williams Lake.
Yeah, that's been in the news.
The one that was the name's escaping me. It'll come to me. Fish Lake. Yeah. And the company's name is escaping me as well, which is being now proposed again. So the EIA there was not approved at the federal level recently, but they are reinitiating the process. So, but one of the things we have done as well is use Canadian experiences to argue that the standards should be elevated in Latin America. So we've done this by supporting litigation happening in Latin American countries, so where activists and communities are bringing legal challenges to mining projects. Those legal challenges are domestic, so they're bringing them directly in their countries, and they're questioning things like, should this environmental impact assessment be approved? Did the company get the community support, and how? So we've intervened in those proceedings, providing expert opinions to the court, saying this same company in Canada would have had to do this, and here they haven't done anything similar. So to suggest that the standards should be elevated, so that's not to say that the standards in Canada are great, but rather like where they're comparatively better, we've used that in particular proceedings to say, so for example, we use the Fish Lake example to say, look, the federal government didn't approve the proposal to drain this lake, where the same thing is being proposed in Peru. We've said, you know, our government, which is very pro-mining, didn't go there, you know, neither should you. So that's one way that we've relied on the Canadian experience, and that's one type of legal work we've done, is intervening in domestic cases as sort of getting intervener status or amicus, friend of the court status, and presenting an opinion, a legal opinion on the issues. Another thing that we've done in the area of public international law is we've supported communities that are presenting complaints to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission about their country's failure to protect their human rights vis-a-vis mining projects. We've also participated in a number of policy reports submitted to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission on Canadian mining companies specifically, and on the Canadian government's failure to regulate specifically. We've supported communities submitting letters and documents to the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous People and other UN bodies. And then, as I was saying, we've worked with Canadian corporate law. So in this area, we've worked with communities submitting complaints to securities regulators, so those that regulate who can list on the TSX, arguing that the corporations are failing to disclose information to their investors about the fact of community opposition. And that's a concern for investors. So that's very interesting, because we're framing community opposition and the community's concerns as a concern for investors. So it's very interesting. We've also done similarly in the area of investment law. We've got together sort of extensive submissions to the Canadian Pension Plan Board, suggesting that they should withdraw their investments from companies on the basis of their evidence of their conduct. We've brought shareholder proposals to companies' annual meetings, proposing that the company act in a certain way and asking the membership, the shareholders, to vote on that. So those are some of the ways that we've used Canadian corporate law. We've also been involved in a lot of several access to information requests. So here, the access to information request is interested in obtaining information about what did the Canadian Embassy and Foreign Affairs do vis-a-vis particular conflicts with Canadian mining companies. What kind of support are they giving Canadian mining companies or not in certain situations? And we're interested in what are, as a legal matter, this is very unexplored, which is what are the Canadian state's sort of legal obligations when promoting Canadian companies? Are there any boundaries around what it can do when it has knowledge of companies' behaviors? That led to, we supported a student who did a wonderful job supporting Mining Watch in writing a report on a particular company in Mexico, which was very well done in terms and demonstrated how the Canadian Embassy proceeded to support the company in spite of very clear knowledge of the company's violence on the ground. That company is now being subjected to criminal investigation in Canada under the Foreign Corruptions Act. So there's really strong evidence that the Canadian government should have sort of taken a more critical stance vis-a-vis the company. So those are some of the sort of legal mechanisms that and all of those projects have heavily engaged students in them.
I was going to say, what a wealth and great source of examples and things to refer students to.
Yeah, so it really, and the type of project and the community, it just really depends on what's happening. It's and the type of mechanism that seems like we might pursue. It's really just a function of strategy and the kinds of facts you have and the kinds of concerns. And
So would the student component of the engagement then be volunteerism? Would it be incorporated into a course, or could it vary?
It really varies, and often students will do a number. So students often don't, it's not just a couple, like sometimes you'll get a student who's a couple months, and we're at the point now where if a student wants to do something, we ask for a cover letter, we ask for a CV, we ask for a transcript. Like, we are selective because it's a lot of work to work with students. We want to make sure that they have high quality capacity to produce high quality work. And so students have done, a lot of this work has happened through directed research courses, and through seminar courses, as well as through volunteer work, as well as through paid research assistant work.
Okay, so there are.
And I should just let me quickly say that some law schools, so Osgoode does, and actually I should really push for that here. They require students to do a certain number of pro bono hours of any kind.
Yes.
So they must, in order to graduate, do 6 or 8 pro bono hours. They can just choose, like the world is the
That's
limit.
great, yeah.
And so they can fulfill their pro bono hour requirement doing
Sure.
stuff like this.
That's not onerous, is it? 6
No,
to 8
not at
hours,
all.
But it does get their feet wet.
Exactly, yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that would be a really good thing for me to push here. I just got that idea now. Great.
Okay, yeah.
I just remembered actually that's one of the other ways. So there are a number of ways, and often a student will, maybe start out as a volunteer, then do an independent research, and then perhaps continue as a volunteer, or maybe will have a few $1,000s for them to do something as an RA. So it just depends.
Okay.
And sometimes the students who've done that work will, sometimes they'll have a very concrete project, like the student who worked on the report on the company in Mexico, so she's got a report posted on Mining Watch's website with her name on it. So that's a very concrete thing. And some of the students that we've involved them in later in doing publishing, so that they've done a lot of the primary research that will go into a paper. So they can be involved. So that, especially my colleague, Shinimai, he's very liberal about recognizing students in that regard, because he's, full professor and he can. So that's great too, to engage them as well in the writing it up at the end.
Right. See, so this gets me thinking about co-curricular record projects for students. Are you familiar with our
No, if I know about that. I don't know if I'm familiar with the term.
Co-curricular record, which is something that we are just in the process of implementing now. It's new to us, but it's an opportunity for students who want to do something in addition to or an add-on to their regular work in their program, can choose and set some learning outcomes for a special project that otherwise they wouldn't be recognized or is not part of the program at all. And the advantage of it is that these co-curricular projects are listed on the formal transcript of the students. So the transcript shows that the students went beyond the minimum requirements of getting the degree and completing the work, but that they actually took on some leadership and some substantial component that was rigorous to the point that learning outcomes are set, they are monitored, confirmation that the students have achieved the learning outcomes that they set. So it's way different from just going out and volunteering and doing something. So it's highly structured, but because it ends up as a separate entry on the student's transcript, it really gives a boost to that transcript, and employers like to see that when they look at a transcript that the student has done something, an extra project or taken that initiative.
And how many hours, more or less, would you think that a project like that would need to involve? I'm sure it varies, but just to get a sense of the kind of weight of.
They are all custom designed. Do you know anything about
No, I don't. They are custom designed. I'm thinking of Mohammed's student in the research. I know they take a series of 4 workshops of a couple of hours each. And but that's all I know about what they're, I don't know about the sort of hands-on work they're doing, so I can't even give you a ballpark figure.
It's interesting to find more information.
Yeah, but we could let you know on that one.
Yeah, that's great. That seems sort of almost like the counterpart to that would be what I described in terms of the pro bono credit requirement, hours requirement.
Yeah.
But this sounds a lot more sort of perhaps structured in terms of the pro bono hours, just somebody has to sign off that they did the hours.
Okay.
But in this, it sounds like it might be a little bit more sort of pedagogically, organized.
Yeah. So we distinguish between co-curricular and extracurricular.
Yeah.
Extracurricular things that could be just volunteer.
Right, whereas this
didn't
complements
have
the
same
curriculum.
goals. But
That's
this
very
has some
interesting.
rigor to it,
Yeah.
so it can be recognized as a real project that was set up and thought through from the beginning with specific outcomes.
And so it's not marked though.
It's assessed.
Yeah, it's
But-
assessed but not marked, you're right.
But there's no
Yeah.
ABC on the transcript.
No,
like,
no,
right?
no.
But it's assessed for.
Mhm.
Interesting. That's something to keep in mind. Yeah, I'm definitely, well, I'm going to be finding out sort of what my teaching load is going to be for next year. And also, next week I have a meeting with my JCAP colleague to make our plans for the summer in terms of student RAs and volunteers and what the projects are that we need to take care of, and my own PhD that I need to complete. So
Have you found TRU students eager to be?
yeah, so
Yes.
far, I mean, in my very little time here, I do have a number of TR students who are currently engaged in a couple of things, and I'm hoping, and I have many who've approached me.
Mhm.
So it'll be a question of just setting them up and ensuring that I have the proper time to supervise, or that a colleague does as well. So it's really just about, designing projects for students, ensuring there's supervision, that they have the right amount of time. And it's often, students have their own sort of cycle of when they have time, when they don't have time, right? So just making sure that you get things going, with enough time to complete before end of March and different things like that. So I do have 3 students currently who are directly involved in this. And I actually have another project that I call Civil Society and the Law, which I have another student doing, which is not JCAP, but maybe a subject for another. But anyways, so there are 4 students currently that I'm working with who are really interested in projects of this nature. But I'm sure that I could work with many more. So I may next year teach a seminar. So this year I taught natural resources law, but I decided to teach it as an exam course because I was so new. I didn't really have the time coming in to set something up, and I had almost 40 students. So it's a little bit of an issue in the law school about like what, if I have 40 students, what can I do in terms of experiential learning, and how would I have to think that through. If I would just allow, maybe 5 students to do an experience, and the rest of them to do a paper or whatever, how would I, or could I pair them up? I'd have to think about it, and I'm going to think about it now, I think, for this coming year, especially if I teach natural resources law again, which hopefully I will.
Yeah. Now,
It's just because of the way the law school is designed, where our numbers are, we're cost recovery, so we have no public funding, so we have pretty large classes. And so it's a resource issue to have a professor's time dedicated to a small class of 10 or 15, which will be the ideal number, I think, in terms of experiential learning. But at present, I think our seminars are 30 as the cap. So you could try to,
divide them up into groups or something.
yeah, you could try to somehow make it less attractive and have less students get. But if they really want it, you would have.
The option is great. I did an experiential learning assignment in a face-to-face course. It was an Aboriginal drama course, actually. And it was a heck of a lot of work, particularly because it was the first time I did it. And I think there were like 17. And I would say that would be absolute maximum. So I agree with you that trying to do with a class of 30. But the idea of it as an option, and you're probably right that you get 5 or something like that. Manageable.
You just have to manage, I think, the politics of who gets to do it, right?
Yes.
And maybe not everybody wants to, but I think that you will ultimately, as a professor, have to select those people. And we've done that in the past, where we've had a seminar of, say, 10 or 15, and some people are just doing sort of more generic research, and others are actually working on a more live issue. You got to write the shareholders proposal, circulate it to the community, circulate it to the NGOs, get feedback, incorporate it. This is the deadline. So the student was, had a higher level of complexity.
Right, yes.
And so, there are some students who will get certain experiences and others won't. And it is, we do have to make those decisions in part based on the capacity that the student has demonstrated so far. And so I think that will ultimately, but I think I'll ultimately probably have to go that route, is just have some selective experiential learning within a larger classroom setting. Yeah, which I don't think is not the ideal route, but it might just be the only one.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Yeah.
It's so impressive that JCAP has done so much in 4 years.
Yeah, it's amazing. We've worked with like about 35 students, and yeah, we've done so much. It's just unbelievable. We can't believe it. But it's great. Anyways, I had my third part, but just to quickly wrap up. So this, going back to what sort of in the socio-legal approach to experiential learning, the idea that it should expose students to some of the normative and relational issues inherent in legal work, and give them the context and perspective they need to make sense of those issues. The way this plays out for JCAP, at least in my view, is to have students think critically about something that we call the governance gap. So the observation that when corporations are involved in improper conduct or human rights violations in developing countries, it's very difficult to hold them to account. And so students then get to look at that problem of the governance gap, or the problem of corporate impunity transnationally, and understand it from a number of vantage points. And this is a very complex issue, and the reasons for this are also very complex. But they do involve sort of understanding the historical and political context of the rule of law problems in developing countries. Why do these countries face such challenges in controlling the corporation, and even why do developed countries face such challenges in regulating the corporation? It exposes them to thinking, or to a greater awareness of the operation of the global economy. So the fact that so many Canadian, globally, the majority of mining companies are Canadian, and the majority of their investments are in Latin America. So looking at global economic patterns and seeing how they sort of connect directly to legal problems.
Trade agreements, hey?
Yeah, and that's the other one. So the way that the way that law creates power inequality or power inequities by, at the international level, supporting the contract and the property rights of corporations through trade agreements, but providing no sort of countervailing support to communities who have concerns with the way those rights are established or defended. And then looking at the way that political and economic interests in Canada have prevented the Canadian government from taking action to regulate the activities of its companies abroad. And so there's now a decade-long history of efforts to propose law reform in Canada on these issues, and to date those efforts have failed. So that's sort of the political and economic side in Canada. And then the legal side also in Canada is the fact that the Canadian courts have, until very recently, with this one exceptional case connected to the Guatemalan woman who came, they've refused to take jurisdiction. So they're not interested in adjudicating the claims that communities have, ruling that it is properly in the jurisdiction of the other country. And so, so students can see how that sort of legal doctrine functions within this broader context to continue to sort of perpetuate the problem of the governance gap. So ultimately, I think, at least in my view, this sort of leads students to reflect, and this kind of goes back to the normative questions about what is Canadian society's responsibility to other societies when we are benefiting in terms of the profits of these activities, but we haven't taken action to ensure that there's also responsibility associated to those profits, and we have higher standards in Canada than we, while we accept that our companies can act according to lower standards in other countries. So those are some of the more sort of moral questions that this issue raises, sort of in a nutshell.
Now, is the reason there are so many Canadian mining companies for tax reasons, or why are we so popular as?
It's because we have such favorable laws for them. Relative to even the UK or the US, we have a much more favorable, and it also often gets its own ecology. Yeah, exactly. So our stock markets and the regulations around them, as well as our courts have signaled that they're not prepared to take jurisdiction, our government has signaled that they're not interested in regulating, and our stock market, like the rules that surround listing on the stock market are favorable. So there's kind of this sort of perfect ecology. And then also we actually, as a derivative of having many companies, we have sort of many supporting consultants and that are also located in Canada. So we have sort of an ecology in terms of the industry. There's a lot of technical expertise located in Canada as a result. Sort of it gets a life of its own. In terms of all of the different kinds of derivative sort of companies that mining companies rely on, from technical support to financial support, et cetera. So that's the, and we also are very, in terms of Export Development Canada, Canadian Pension Plan, we're very willing to invest, the government is very willing to invest in companies and to promote them. So it's a favorable environment in a lot of ways for companies. But yeah, the numbers are amazing. I mean, in terms of that piece, 57% of the world's publicly traded mining companies are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So it just is like unbelievable in terms of, if you think of all the stock, if you think of all the other possibilities. And they're so significant for our economy as well. So mining companies are the largest single group of outward investors. So of all the foreign investment that comes from Canada to the world, the largest sort of clump or sector is the mining sector. And then in terms of Latin America, of all Canadian foreign mining assets, approximately 50% are invested in Latin America. So we're very strong there. And on the other end, almost 50% of all mines in Latin America are Canadian owned. So there's a very intense relationship with Latin America in particular. And the presence of the Canadian companies are very prominent globally. So it is a real focus in terms of the global economy, the Canadian market. And Canadian company typically means that they're headquartered in Canada, incorporated in Canada, and they trade on our stock exchange.
Right.
So because they trade on our stock exchange, obviously the public is very much invested in them as well, through different kinds of.
Yeah, it's very interesting because every once in a while on the news, one of these issues, usually from Latin America, about a local community having trouble with a mining company and their water supply or whatever. But given how many we have there and the scope of our operations, you think it would be a lot more frequent, or a lot of these things just don't make the news.
I think recently I'm surprised at actually how many have made the news and the type of prominence that they've had. But I mean, even when they do make the news, I mean, I've seen actually in terms of one of the companies in Guatemala, there's a whole CBC radio documentary. And so, they make the news, but the news is so here today, it's hard to really, they don't capture sort of there's no national debate on this, for example. So it isn't that high profile, even when it does make the news. It's sort of here today, gone tomorrow kind of thing. Yeah. But there are increasingly, I've seen, even on the 6 o'clock news sometimes, certain reports and different things.
Yeah. Okay, one more thing. Do you ever have students that have come through another TRU program? I taught for a long, long time in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences here.
Oh, great.
And we did have some students who said that they were interested in natural resource law as they started coming through the program. But of course, back then, before we had our law school, they went elsewhere. The graduates of our own programs here could apply and enter our own program here, right?
Certainly. So we have worked with engineers and different experts, technical experts, who help us understand, environmental impact assessments, and that kind of students who are from other disciplines could certainly support projects and provide their sort of expertise. It would be hard for me or someone within JCAP to supervise them, because we could give them the questions that we have, and in particular, especially when we were trying to figure out different things, different technical standards in Canada, vis-a-vis mine closure, different kinds of things, and try to translate those for the Peruvian court that where there was a proceeding going on around an environmental impact assessment there. You know, we did rely, in that case, I think it was in the group of environmental engineers in Montreal. So one of the things that's important is that we need to find technical people who aren't in a conflict, who aren't being employed by a company that's, you know, like a lot of, for example, engineering firms will have a number of clients, and they can have a company as so it's very important to first of all ask that kind of question and make sure that we do have confidentiality agreements that we have students sign, different types of formal policies. And we would want to make sure that the student or whoever was supervising them wasn't in a conflict or didn't have any sort of conflict of interest due to other work that they're doing.
Right.
So that's one sort of thing to take care of. And then the other thing is if it was a student, we would probably want to have sort of a counterpart professional supervising their work as well. But yeah, those possibilities definitely exist. I haven't interacted with anyone in the Department of Natural Resources because of the limited time I've had here, but I think it would be great. And I know that a lot of people are quite sympathetic to these concerns. So that's a great possibility. Yeah, especially just to have that type of a contact person to, you know, when the questions come up to be able to pose them.
Charis, thanks so much. That was fascinating. What a great opportunity for students. I mean, global kinds of opportunities, right? While they're still students.
No, it's definitely a fun project. Always interesting, and no specific area of law, so you're always learning something new. It's very, in terms of law, like really crosses all kinds of boundaries. So that's something that makes it fun. Yeah. Oh, thank you guys.
If you ever think of ways that others in the teaching center could assist in any way with what you do, let us know.
Yeah.
I don't know what that might be, teaching strategies or whatever to accompany what you're trying to do.
Yeah, well, I've seen like several of the, a couple now, I can't think of any of the specific titles, but of the seminars that you've held are interest to me because I'm a new professor, and just in terms of learning different kinds of methodologies, etc. I feel like I have a lot to learn in that regard. So definitely I want to be connected, and especially just in benefit from discussions on teaching, and
Sure, yeah.
and I know you, as you call it, the scholarship of teaching and learning and stuff. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I find in law it is really a challenge. There's a lot of pressure to cover a certain number of pages in a class, cover a certain number of cases, and it's really intense. The preparation time for teaching to teach is really intense in the classroom environment. So there definitely is pressure. You know, when I started was designing my syllabus for the natural resources law course, because I created it basically from scratch in the summer, and I asked some professors at Osgoode, like, how many pages should I be teaching in a class? And my supervisor said 25 for a 3-hour class. People here were saying 60. So I'll give you a sense, there's just, and I actually find that 25 is a comfortable amount to teach, and but there are, there can be approaches that are really demanding in terms of, and I find that creates a pedagogical model of this, like, basically just rapid fire lecture.
It's a model that students derive the least.
But that's, the law is, the way it's been taught is traditionally is really, really traditional. So
sort of like on TV or in those movies.
Yeah, it's really.
Yeah. No, there's certainly many areas where the tradition and the accrediting bodies are behind in effective teaching pedagogy.
Yeah, I know, and it goes back to that idea of, as I said earlier, like the tension between a perception that students should read as much doctrine as possible, read as many cases as possible, And the idea that, no, it doesn't matter what they read, they're going to forget it anyways. What we need to do is teach them how to think critically and to learn to adapt to new forms of knowledge. And so we need to teach them to learn how to learn,
Absolutely.
as opposed to just giving them information.
Yes.
But the information model is still very dominant, for sure.
Yeah.
And it needs to be there. I mean, definitely law is a skill. Like, it's not, you do need to understand how to read a case and this and that. But the idea that you should come through law school and, that you could just study all these different areas of law. I mean, in practice, lawyers actually work in very diverse settings where, so what they do afterwards is very disconnected from even that doctrinal approach. Is people argue like very useless, even though it purports to be sort of giving them the technical information.
Well, if there are ways we can reach out to the law faculty, you're our first presenter from law, and I think Tash has attended a couple of presentations over the years.
Tash is great.
But I know hardly anyone in your faculty. And of course, we offer a lot of workshops. Then there are campus-wide things like teaching practices colloquium.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I should say that a couple of my colleagues just recently proposed some kind of a discussion group at our law school where we would come together and exchange ideas and practices around teaching.
That's lovely.
Yeah, I don't know really what the structure of it's going to be or when, but they did propose it over email and said, what is it? What do people think? And everyone, of course, said yes. So there is an interest in doing something like that.
That's good.
And I mean, I think that we would probably all benefit from some sort of expertise type of reflection on teaching as well. So maybe something to do would be to actually have someone come in and do a workshop with us that we could try to tailor to the realities of the law school. Yeah, that might be one. I could actually suggest that as a way of sort of kicking off their series.
Yeah, and I could give you some ideas about what's called peer observation, which is a non-judgmental observing of other instructors teaching.
I think there is some of that, but I don't know how much. I mean, our people are pretty busy, but yeah, I think that would be a good thing as well to look into.
That's so good that is coming from the faculty. My sense would be to let that play out for a while and then
maybe bring you in. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'll see. I mean, they mentioned a couple weeks ago, but I didn't hear any follow-up. So, yeah. Good. Well, I should run. I have my course in 45 minutes. Of course, I'm just madly preparing.
Well, thank you so much.